You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music. A 40-year-old man stood next to his teenage daughter in a hospital room, clutching her hand as she lay there unconscious on a gurney. A flurry of doctors and nurses moved all around them, securing an oxygen mask over the girl's nose and jabbing her arms with needles. The father couldn't believe this was really happening. Just an hour ago, he'd come home to find his daughter passed out on the floor of the kitchen. Her face and neck were totally beet red. He didn't know what had happened, but his best guess was that maybe she had accidentally overheated the oven while making food, and then when she opened up the oven door, a rush of heat came out and it burned her. He didn't know what else could make her look so sunburned on such a cloudy December day. A nurse put her arms on the father's shoulders and told him he needed to step aside. So the father squeezed his daughter's hand one more time, then let the nurse guide him out of the hospital room. The nurse told the father that his daughter's kidneys were failing. They were going to rush her to the intensive care unit for emergency dialysis. The father blinked, trying to process what the nurse had just told him. He didn't understand how his daughter's burned skin could lead to kidney failure. People died from that. He watched helplessly as the medical team wheeled his daughter's gurney out of the room and down the hallway. And as they disappeared through a set of double doors, it hit him that he might have just seen his little girl alive for the last time. The father prayed that her doctors could figure out what was wrong with her before it was too late. From Ballin Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballin, and this is Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new, baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you like today's story, please ask the follow button if you can borrow their favorite hairbrush, and then when they say yes, only use it on your Maine Coon cat, and then without cleaning it, give it back. This episode is called The Sunless Burn. It was December 1979, and a young woman named Rose Harmon shivered in the cold at a bus stop in Madison, Wisconsin. The ground was covered in icy gray slush, and the whipping wind chilled her to the bone. But still, Rose couldn't help feeling cheery. All the lampposts around her were decorated with Christmas lights, and she just loved the way the city looked this time of the year. The 18-year-old high school student shifted her backpack from one shoulder to the other as her bus finally arrived at the stop. When the hydraulic doors opened, Rose stepped on board, and immediately it hit her how much warmer it was inside of the bus than it was outside, to the point where her cheeks flushed and she lowered the hood on her jacket. But as she walked towards the back of the bus, it just felt like the temperature inside the bus was only rising. Rose unbuttoned her parka, but it didn't help. She began sweating, and then suddenly Rose felt so overheated she could barely breathe. The edges of her vision went dark as she tried her best to gulp down air and get her coat off. She could hear people around her reacting to her strange, desperate behavior. Someone was telling the bus driver to pull over, call an ambulance. And then Rose felt a sharp pain in her knees as she collapsed to the floor, and then everything went black. A few hours later, Dr. Russell Chesney made his way to the intensive care unit at the University of Wisconsin Medical Center. Dr. Chesney was a kidney specialist, and any time he was paged to go to the ICU, it was usually bad news. And tonight was no exception. He just received a call from the emergency room letting him know that they were rushing a patient named Rose Harmon up to the ICU for kidney failure. When Dr. Chesney reached Rose's room, he saw a doctor standing at the foot of her bed, scribbling something down on a medical chart, while a nurse rummaged through a black backpack that was sitting on the cabinet along the wall. The doctor at the foot of the bed looked up as Dr. Chesney came inside the room, and the doctor kind of motioned to the unconscious young woman lying right there in the hospital bed with the oxygen mask strapped over her face. Dr. Chesney looked at Rose and felt his chest tighten. He knew Rose was only 18 years old, but in person, she looked even younger. She was far too young to be suffering from kidney failure. Dr. Chesney stepped closer to the bed and noticed that the girl's face and hands were covered in a blotchy pink rash that made it look like she was very badly sunburned. The doctor who had already been in the room told Dr. Chesney that Rose had come into the ER unconscious and with a very high fever. She was barely breathing, and when the doctor performed an initial exam, he heard crackling in her lungs. It was a warning sign that her lungs were filled with fluid, and they needed to perform a procedure to drain them. However, before they could extract the fluid, Rose's kidneys began to fail, and so that was when they had called Dr. Chesney. Dr. Chesney couldn't believe how quickly Rose seemed to be breaking down, and Dr. Chesney had never seen anything like this list of symptoms she had, especially her sunburn-like rash. He knew that Rose's body was in shock, which meant that it wasn't properly able to pump blood to all her organs. That was why her lungs and kidneys were failing. But he had no idea why Rose's body had gone into shock in the first place. And in order to save Rose, that was the question that Dr. Chesney would have to answer. Otherwise, even if he could stabilize her right now, she would eventually go back into shock. Given the rapid onset of Rose's symptoms, Dr. Chesney guessed that she must have contracted a very serious infection. He needed lab work to better understand what was wrong with Rose, but there was no time to wait for test results, which could take up to a couple of days. She needed help right now. A moment later, the nurse returned and told Dr. Chesney that she'd found Rose's ID in her backpack and contacted her parents. Dr. Chesney thanked the nurse and gave her a new task: to start Rose on a few different antibiotics. He hoped that one of them would stop the infection from spreading. And in the meantime, after they used a long needle to drain the fluid from her lungs, he would order as many tests as possible to identify the source of the infection. Dr. Chesney also decided to put Rose on dialysis, meaning a machine would now be flushing toxins from her kidneys, since her own kidneys were not able to do that. They were failing. While the nurses got everything started, Dr. Chesney left to go check on some other patients and promised he would be back soon. An hour later, Dr. Chesney turned back into Rose's room. The sunburn rash had spread up her arms, making her look even worse. He checked her vitals and was dismayed at what he saw. Rose's blood pressure had fallen, which meant that her body was not coming out of shock. So Rose's body still was not pumping enough blood to her organs. Dr. Chesney decided to give the antibiotics one more hour to maybe work. It was nearing the end of his shift, but he wanted Rose to stabilize before he left the hospital. But when Dr. Chesney came back to check on her the next time, he could immediately tell the antibiotics were still not working. The rash had spread even more. Now it fully covered Rose's arms and legs. Her blood pressure was even lower than before. Dr. Chesney was bewildered. The antibiotics should be able to fight off a wide variety of infections, so whatever Rose was fighting had to be extremely rare and very potent. Dr. Chesney clearly could not afford to sit around and wait for Rose's test results to come back, otherwise it would be too late to help her. So he ordered a chest x-ray, thinking maybe it would reveal that she had a bad case of pneumonia. As orderlies wheeled Rose's gurney toward the x-ray suite, a nurse came into the room and told Dr. Chesney that Rose's parents had arrived at the hospital. Dr. Chesney immediately hurried out into the waiting room, meeting the parents right as they stepped off the elevator. Dr. Chesney was anxious to speak with them about Rose's health and felt a pang of empathy at the looks of sheer terror on their faces. Dr. Chesney invited them to sit with him for a moment. He explained that Rose was getting a chest x-ray and they could see her after that. And in the meantime, he asked her parents to walk him through Rose's medical history. Specifically, he wanted to know if she'd been sick at all in the past week, or if anyone around her at home had been sick. But Rose's parents shook their heads, no. The mother assured the doctor that they'd all been feeling fine. They also hadn't received any word of any illnesses circulating at Rose's high school either. And the more they talked about Rose's medical history, the more it became apparent to Dr. Chesney that Rose was a very healthy, average 18-year-old girl. And so Dr. Chesney was stumped. Dr. Chesney didn't have any more questions to ask, so he thanked her parents and promised he'd come get them the moment they could see their daughter. Then he turned on his heels and hurried back down the hallway towards Rose's room, anxious for the results of her x-ray. Thankfully, as soon as Dr. Chesney arrived, Rose's nurse was putting up all the x-rays on a light box so he could look at them. And Dr. Chesney took one look at the x-rays and he gasped. Rose did not have pneumonia, but the reason she was having trouble breathing was very obvious. There was bleeding in her lungs. Dr. Chesney could clearly see that Rose's symptoms were getting more and more dire. But almost worse than that, they seemed kind of random and disconnected. They were not pointing him anywhere. There was one piece of good news, though. When Dr. Chesney checked Rose's vitals, he saw that her blood pressure was rising. This meant the treatments they were doing were finally working, and Rose was coming out of the shock. And so Dr. Chesney decided that Rose was stable enough for her parents to come see her, even if she would not be awake. So he turned out of Rose's room and headed back to the reception area where Rose's parents were waiting patiently, still looking absolutely terrified. He called them over and then led them back into their daughter's room, standing back to give them room by her bedside. He told the parents that in his opinion, Rose would likely regain consciousness as her body stabilized. But what Dr. Chesney did not tell them was that he had no idea why their daughter's lungs were bleeding. He also had no idea why she landed in the hospital in the first place. Her symptoms were just totally confusing. And so Dr. Chesney knew he would need to consult with someone he trusted. So Dr. Chesney said goodnight to Rose's parents and he left the hospital and made his way to the home of a respected colleague. It also happened to be his own home. 20 minutes later, Dr. Chesney's wife, Joan, had just thrown 2 chicken breasts in the oven when she heard keys rattling in the front door, then a familiar sound of footsteps moving through their foyer. Joan turned to greet Dr. Chesney as he walked into the kitchen and threw his car keys on the built-in desk near the fridge. He had a distant look on his face, as though he were lost in thought. Joan frowned. She could tell that her husband was stressed out about something. As she pulled more vegetables from the fridge, she asked him what was wrong. Dr. Chesney sighed and told her all about his new patient, Rose, and her baffling list of symptoms. He was at a total dead end, and he needed his wife's help to figure out what was wrong with her. Joan nodded and put down her knife so she could think. Dr. Chesney's request was not unusual because Joan was also a doctor. The couple frequently bounced ideas off of each other when they had challenging cases. Joan was an infectious disease specialist, and odd cases like this came across her desk all the time. And to Joan, something about Rose's symptoms, the fever, shock, and kidney failure, sounded familiar, but for the life of her, she couldn't remember why. Joan asked more questions about Rose, hoping that something might jog her memory, but she had no luck. She promised her husband she'd keep thinking about it, and then she went back to chopping up the vegetables. Now she was lost in thought as well. When Joan woke up the next morning, Rose was immediately on her mind. In fact, the night before, she had even had a dream about Rose. It felt like the answer to what was going on with Rose was just beyond her fingertips. As Joan got out of bed, she decided she would pay Rose a visit herself that morning. She thought that maybe just seeing Rose in person might help her put the pieces together. An hour later, Joan followed her husband, Dr. Chesney, into Rose's room in the ICU. Joan was shocked as she laid eyes on Rose, who was still unconscious. The sunburned-looking rash now covered Rose's entire body, including the palms of her hands. Joan had never seen a rash like this in her entire career. She thought it looked almost like a chemical burn and wondered aloud if Rose could have been exposed to a chemical that her body absorbed through her skin. Or maybe she took a drug that her parents were not aware of at maybe a high school party or something like that. Dr. Chesney told his wife that the lab results should be ready any moment, and hopefully they would help them find an answer. Dr. Chesney said he'd go check on the test results' progress, and then he stepped out of the room. While Joan waited for him to come back, she decided to check Rose's pupils and her reflexes. So Joan pulled a flashlight from the pocket of her white lab coat and then gently pulled back Rose's eyelids. Joan was surprised to see that Rose's eyes were totally bloodshot. Joan was alarmed. She didn't know of any infections that caused shock and bloodshot eyes like this. She began to wonder if they were witnessing the birth of some new and potentially deadly disease. The prospect was terrifying, and it sent Joan hurrying out of the room and down the hallway to find her husband. Two mornings later, Joan was on her way out of the hospital to attend a local conference on infectious diseases. Rose's test results had finally come back, but they were inconclusive. Thankfully, Rose had finally woken up and was stable for the time being. But Joan and her husband were not any closer to solving her case. Joan hoped that talking to some colleagues at this conference might help her come up with some new ideas. But before she could leave the building, she received a page calling her down to the ER. This was unusual. She wondered why an infectious disease specialist would be needed in the emergency room. But in the pit of her stomach, she feared she already knew the answer, that she was right, that Rose was suffering from some brand new deadly disease, and now it was spreading, and so they might have new patients downstairs. Joan hustled across the hospital, anxiety really starting to settle in. Moments later, she rushed into the ER to find another young woman lying on a gurney covered in a sunburn-like rash who was also struggling to breathe. An ER doctor was helping two nurses wheel the patient into a hospital room. As Joan walked beside them, the doctor told her that the patient was a 15-year-old girl who had collapsed in her kitchen. Like Rose, this new patient had developed her symptoms suddenly, and her parents had rushed her to the hospital right after she'd collapsed. Joan suddenly felt a knot in her stomach. She knew that two young women with the same bizarre symptoms could not be a coincidence. But she didn't have time right now to worry about a potential new epidemic. The patient in front of her was crashing. Joan followed the ER doctor into the patient's room, and as she did, she told the doctor the exact cocktail of IV fluids and dialysis that her husband, Dr. Chesney, had given to Rose. The ER doctor thanked Joan for saving him a call up to the ICU. Joan gave him a grim smile. She knew this treatment she had suggested would likely stabilize this new patient for the time being, but she knew it would not cure her. Joan looked down at her watch and realized she might be late for this conference, and so she needed to leave right now. She needed to attend this conference really for the sake of Rose and this new patient. Joan hoped that one of her colleagues at this conference might recognize the symptoms these two girls were showing and be able to help figure out what was making them sick so they could finally treat them and cure them. An hour later, Joan walked into a large lecture hall, a styrofoam cup of coffee in her hand. The desks had all been arranged in a big circle, and so Joan took a seat on the far side of the room. There were already a few colleagues getting settled, and so Joan waved at a friend as she set her things down and took out her notepad. All morning, specialists took turns presenting cases that involved different infectious diseases. Some had been solved, and others still needed to be diagnosed. They were all interesting, but it was the last case that caught Joan's attention. The speaker handed around copies of a file for one of his current patients. She was a 25-year-old woman, also local to the area, and just like Rose and the 15-year-old girl at the hospital, this patient had also experienced sudden kidney failure, a high fever, and a sunburn-like rash. The presenter broadly described the diagnosis as kidney failure with shock, although they had no idea what had caused her kidneys to fail in the first place. As soon as the presentation was over, Joan hurried over to the last speaker to talk to them about their patient and maybe compare notes. The two doctors looked over the patient's files together, and quickly they saw all three cases were basically identical. The other doctor looked at Joan hopefully and asked if she'd been able to figure out what was making these young women go into shock. Joan just shook her head. She said she was still trying to figure it out, and in fact, that was why she had come over to talk to this doctor, because she was hopeful that they had the answer to what was going on. And so Joan silently ran over the symptoms again in her head, trying to put the pieces together, and then out of nowhere, it just clicked. Suddenly, Joan remembered where she had read about this disease before, in a journal article published a year earlier. That was why, when her husband, Dr. Chesney, had come home and first told her about the symptoms Rose was showing, they seemed so familiar. This article was the reason. Joan quickly thanked her colleague and promised she'd be in touch. Then she hurried out the door and drove back to the Madison Medical Center as fast as she could, and then nearly ran to her office. Once she got there, she began rummaging through the stacks of articles and journals that she'd spent the past 2 days piling up on her desk. Finally, she found the one she'd been looking for. It was in a medical journal called The Lancet. Joan flipped through the pages and found the article that had been published a year earlier. It described the case of an adolescent girl who'd suffered the exact same rashes and other symptoms as Rose and the other two patients. The article described how the girl had contracted a strange new illness caused by a potentially deadly bacteria that entered her body through an open wound. The result, the researchers concluded, was a disease that had never been seen before. Joan tapped her foot, thinking, The symptoms matched, but neither of her patients had any open wounds on their bodies. There was clearly some piece of the puzzle that was still missing. Joan decided to order one more test for both Rose and the 15-year-old girl to see if they were infected with the same bacteria as the girls referenced in this article. In a day or two, she would know whether her current cases and the cases from this article were actually linked. But in the meantime, she knew that if there were already 3 cases of this potential bacterial illness, there would be more. And so she decided it was now time to call the Wisconsin Department of Public Health and tell them they had a potentially very big problem on their hands. The next afternoon, Joan was sitting in her office catching up on paperwork when a tall man wearing a nice suit knocked on her doorframe. He looked anxious and out of breath as he introduced himself as Dr. Jeff Davis, an investigator with the State Department of Health. He'd spent the entire morning interviewing family members of the 3 women affected by this mystery disease. Joan stood up immediately and thanked him and said, "Please come in and sit down," but Dr. Davis just shook his head and said he couldn't stay. He just wanted Joan to know that he did find a link between the 3 cases. Dr. Davis explained that the 3 patients had almost nothing in common. They didn't eat the same things, they didn't go to the same places, or live similar lifestyles. The only thing they shared was the fact that they were all young women. And so he thought that they could have something in common biologically, and he'd wondered if maybe they had all been menstruating at the time they got sick. So he checked their charts and learned that yes, all 3 were having their period when their symptoms developed. Also, Rose, who was now able to speak, would tell Dr. Davis that she actually remembered getting a similar-looking rash on her body the month before when she had her period the last time. This was a promising link, but Dr. Davis said he didn't know what it meant, or if it was even relevant at all. After he was done speaking, Dr. Davis just looked at Joan expectantly, as though she could now solve the mystery. But Joan wasn't sure what to say. It didn't make sense. There was nothing about a period that would make these women so sick. But Joan knew that this connection was really all they had to go on, so she couldn't just dismiss the theory outright. And so instead, she took a seat and picked up Dr. Davis's notes from all the family meetings he had just had, and she began to read over them. The next morning, Joan stepped into her office to find the lab results sitting on her desk. She felt a rush of energy as she grabbed them and began scanning the documents in her hand. It would turn out both of her patients, Rose and the 15-year-old girl, had tested positive for a life-threatening infection from bacteria called Staphylococcus aureus. This was the same bacteria that infected the girls in the Lancet article Joan had read, which meant Rose and the 15-year-old girl had the new syndrome outlined in the article, which the researchers named toxic shock syndrome. Joan breathed a small sigh of relief. At least she knew what she was treating now. She hoped that with enough specialized care, both of her patients lying in the ICU would make a full recovery. But Joan still had a very big problem. She still didn't know how her patients could have contracted the deadly staph infection in the first place. They had no open wounds, no place for the bacteria to enter the bloodstream. She remembered Dr. Davis's observation that all the women were on their periods at the time. Joan wondered if Rose and the 15-year-old girl had taken a contaminated painkiller to alleviate their cramps, and maybe that's why they got sick. But this was only a theory, and until doctors figured it out, more people would likely get sick. Joan hoped Dr. Davis and the other investigators at the Department of Health would be able to find the cause quickly. About 6 weeks later, on a cold morning in late February 1980, an epidemiologist at the National Centers for Disease Control named Bruce Dan drove to work, feeling completely at a loss. He had spent almost 2 months trying to find the cause of the toxic shock infections in Madison, Wisconsin, and other locations all over the United States. To date, no one could figure out what was causing the illness or how to stop what was now a nationwide epidemic. By now, the mysterious infections had become national news. And as Dr. Dan pulled into the parking lot at the CDC, a story about toxic shock came on the radio. He listened as the reporter summarized the stats that Dr. Dan had already memorized. Since early December, 107 cases of toxic shock had surfaced in 33 states around the country. Thankfully, no deaths have been reported yet. Dr. Dan switched off the radio, parked his car, and walked to his office in silence. As he said good morning to his secretary handed him a stack of memos. This had become routine, because ever since the newspapers, TV, and radio started publishing daily reports on toxic shock, Dr. Dan had received hundreds of calls from women all across the country experiencing similar symptoms. Dr. Dan thanked the secretary and was about to leave when she stopped him and she handed him one more memo. He looked down at it, and as he read it, his stomach dropped. That morning, a young woman living in Wisconsin had become the first person to die from this mysterious infection. This woman was not one of Joan's patients, so she was not Rose or the 15-year-old girl, and in fact, by this point, Rose and the 15-year-old girl had actually fully recovered and were back with their families. But now it was clear to Dr. Dan that this infection could turn deadly, and Dr. Dan had been too late to stop it. He walked into his office so upset he wanted to kick his desk chair. He had always been very motivated to solve this mystery, but now his motivation was through the roof. He decided it was time for drastic action. He would find the answer to this riddle no matter the cost. Over the next few weeks, Dr. Dan and his team made thousands of phone calls interviewing women who were being treated for toxic shock. They also talked to young women who were not getting sick for comparison. At the end of each day, Dr. Dan would spend hours in his office reading the notes taken during each of these calls, searching for anything that stood out. Meanwhile, the number of toxic shock cases mounted. Within a month, more than 100 serious cases had been reported, and this only motivated Dr. Dan to work harder and stay later, losing himself in his notes. And finally, after 4 weeks of hard work, Dr. Dan found a link. He discovered that all the women who developed toxic shock syndrome used tampons when they menstruated, not pads. Dr. Dan sat at his desk, scratching his chin. He knew he was onto something. Granted, tampons had been on the market for more than 50 years. In fact, 50 million women used them every month in the United States alone. Out of that 50 million, only several hundred had gotten sick. So clearly, the vast majority of tampons were causing no problem at all. Dr. Dan rapped his pen on the desk, thinking, and he wondered maybe it was just one brand of tampons that had somehow become contaminated in some way. And so he decided to begin calling tampon manufacturers, and what he found would finally solve the mystery. As Dr. Dan and his colleagues conducted their surveys, they discovered that in about 70% of the toxic shock cases, the women used tampons from a brand called Rely. Specifically, they used the heavily absorbent version. At first, this didn't make sense to Dr. Dan. Rely had introduced the heavily absorbent tampons 6 years earlier, in 1974, but there was no evidence linking them to toxic shock until this outbreak had started in late 1979. However, right before the outbreak began, Rely began using synthetic materials. And the other brands, which accounted for the other 30% of toxic shock cases, also were using synthetic materials, just not as much. It turned out that while these materials allowed for much better absorbency, they also helped promote the growth of the bacteria that causes toxic shock. Once Dr. Dan discovered the link between Rely tampons and toxic shock, the CDC published an article with their findings. For Dr. Joan Chesney and her husband Russell, the study was a huge relief. Thankfully, all their patients had fought off the deadly infection, and now that the word was out, they were hopeful the outbreak would taper off. After some initial resistance, Rely superabsorbent tampons were finally pulled from the shelves in September of 1980. By that point, 772 women had developed toxic shock syndrome from using tampons, and the majority of them used Rely tampons. Tragically, 38 of those women died. Their deaths inspired new industry regulations to reduce the absorbency of tampons and also to print mandatory warning labels on the boxes. And since then, toxic shock syndrome has become incredibly rare, with only a handful of deaths every year. From Ballin Studios and Wondery, this is Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballin. A quick note about our stories: we use aliases sometimes because we don't know the names of the real people in the story, and also, in most cases, we can't know exactly what was said, but everything is based on a lot of research. And a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Aaron Land. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Matthew Chaleli. Our coordinating producer is Taylor Sniffen, and our managing producer is Sophia Martins. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and researchers are Sarah Vitak and Tasia Palakonda. Fact-checking was done by Sheila Patterson. For Ballin Studios, our head of production is Zach Levitt. Script editing is by Scott Allen and Evan Allen. Our coordinating producer is Matub Zaire. Executive producers are myself, Mr. Ballin, and Nick Witters. For Wondery, our head of sound is Marcelino Villapando. Senior producers are Loredana Palavoda and Dave Schilling. Senior managing producer is Ryan Lohr. Our executive producers are Aaron O'Flaherty and Marshall Louis for Wondery. You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music. On a December evening in the late 1970s, a teenage girl sat at a bus stop in St. Louis, Missouri. Freezing wind whipped against her face, and so she zipped up her old worn-out coat and tried to stop her teeth from chattering. When the bus finally pulled up, the girl didn't get on. She couldn't afford the fare, and she didn't have anywhere to go. And so as the sun set, she curled up on the bus bench, hoping she would just make it through the night without getting frostbite. As she laid there in the cold, she prayed for her life to change. She dreamed of having a good job, a warm bed, and a family that loved her. What she didn't know was that in just a few years, she would have all of those things and more. However, that dream life would turn out to be a nightmare. From Ballin Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballin, and this is Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new, baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. So, if you like today's story, please offer to remodel the Follow Button's home for free, but after you do all the demolition, just abandon the job. This episode is called Mother or Murderer. On July 4th, 1989, 24-year-old Patty Stallings stood on the porch of her home in Hillsboro, Missouri, which is a suburb of St. Louis. She and her husband, 27-year-old David, had recently purchased this house, which overlooked Lake Wawanoka. That night, they could actually see the local Independence Day fireworks show right from their front porch. However, instead of looking up at the fireworks, both of them were just admiring their 4-month-old son, Ryan, who cooed as Patty cradled him in her arms. A sense of gratitude washed over Patty as she locked eyes with her husband. She couldn't believe how much her life had changed in just a few short years. As a teenager, she'd lived on the streets, with nothing of her own and no one to protect her. In her early 20s, she had gotten a job at a convenience store, a 7-Eleven, hoping to turn her life around. But things hadn't really changed until 3 years ago, in 1986, when she had met her future husband David, who worked as a professional plate engraver. He and Patty had clicked right away, and they got married in 1988 and were soon able to purchase this dream home, the small lake house with white trim and a nice front porch. Because of her husband, Patty was the happiest she had ever been in her entire life. As the fireworks continued to illuminate the night sky, Patty looked back down at her baby's peaceful face tucked up against her chest. But then, out of nowhere, her baby, Ryan, vomited all over Patty's shirt, way more than how much babies usually spit up. But Patty wasn't too concerned. Ryan had suffered from digestive problems since he was just 2 weeks old, and his doctors had assured her as long as he was gaining weight, he was okay. And Ryan was hitting all of his weight benchmarks, so Patty trusted he would be okay. But still, when Patty went inside to get changed, and also to change the baby, she wanted to make sure Ryan didn't appear sick. He didn't seem fussy or uncomfortable, and he smiled and cooed at her as she changed him into a fresh onesie, and so Patty figured everything must still be fine. So she finished dressing her baby, then she changed her own clothes, and then the pair went back outside to enjoy the rest of the fireworks with David. 5 days later, Patty woke up in her large, sunny bedroom feeling unusually well rested. She rolled over in bed to find the other side was empty. David had already left for work. She checked the clock on her nightstand and saw that it was almost 9 a.m. She'd slept in longer than usual. She listened for the sounds of her son crying for breakfast, but the house was silent. But Patty didn't think much of it. She was actually thankful to have such a nice, quiet, slow morning for once. Patty made her way into the kitchen, she brewed a cup of coffee, and then sat down on the couch. She spent a moment enjoying the peace and quiet, but after a few minutes passed, she started feeling uneasy. It wasn't normal for her baby to sleep this late. And so Patty tiptoed into the nursery, and she found her son lying in his crib, but he wasn't asleep. His eyes were wide open in a glassy stare. His lips were pressed tightly shut, and his chest rose and fell way too fast, like he was having trouble catching his breath. Patty's stomach dropped. She'd never seen her son look so sick before. She lifted his limp body out of the crib, and almost immediately, Ryan began vomiting almost uncontrollably. Patty was so scared she began shaking. Still carrying her baby, she ran into the living room. She grabbed the phone, but she didn't call 911. She lived far from the hospital and knew that waiting for an ambulance would waste time Ryan probably didn't have. She knew it would be faster just to take him to the hospital herself. So she called the St. Louis Children's Hospital and told the operator she was on her way. "10 minutes later, Patty sped down the highway towards St. Louis. She wasn't familiar with the roads, and driving in the city made her nervous. And so as cars honked and swerved around her, she tried to look down at the paper map in her lap to read it, but it was really hard to do that and also drive. As Patty turned around to check her blind spot, she caught a glimpse of Ryan in his car seat. It looked like his chest was barely moving. Afraid her son was just going to stop breathing altogether, Patty turned back around and just began looking out ahead for any highway sign that might just tell her where to go. Right up ahead, she noticed a sign that had a big H on it right near an exit ramp, and Patty knew that meant there had to be a hospital close by. So she flipped on her blinker, she got off the freeway, and followed the hospital signs towards the emergency room. It wasn't until she pulled into the parking lot of that hospital that she realized it was not the St. Louis Children's Hospital that she had called. The sign on the building that she was at said Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital. But really, it didn't matter to Patty. She was just happy to be somewhere with doctors who could help her son. So she turned off her car, she jumped out, and she opened up the back door, and she reached in, and Ryan's tiny body was just so limp in his car seat. Patty unstrapped him carefully and then picked him up and held him tight to her chest. She could barely hear his shallow breathing as she ran with him inside the emergency room. Once she was inside, Patty rushed to the check-in desk and explained what was going on. A young nurse arrived quickly and ushered her and her son into the pediatric intensive care unit. The nurse then took Ryan out of Patty's arms and brought him into an examination room. Patty followed, feeling totally helpless. As Patty walked into the room, she saw her son was already being hooked up to a nasal cannula, which is like a thin tube with two prongs that are inserted into the nose. When they turned it on, it sent oxygen into Ryan's lungs, helping him breathe. Within moments, Patty could see her son's chest was now rising and falling normally, and she was so relieved. As soon as the ER doctor confirmed that yes, Ryan was stable now, Patty asked a nurse to use the hospital phone. She needed to call her husband. Later that day, Patty and her husband David sat by Ryan's bedside, watching him breathe through the tube attached to his nose. After such a frantic morning and afternoon, Patty was totally exhausted, and David, who had left work early to be there, was also very tired. And so as the anxiety of the day began to fade away, because Ryan was very stable at this point, the parents began to nod off. But before they could fall asleep, an older man in a white coat entered the room. He had graying hair and a round, reddish face. He sat down next to the parents and introduced himself as Dr. Stevens, the hospital's chief of pediatrics. Patty couldn't read the doctor's expression, It was like he'd practiced keeping his face totally neutral, most likely so he could deliver any kind of news, good or bad, with some level of professional distance. Dr. Stevens told the parents that their son, Ryan, seemed like he was going to be okay, but he really wasn't sure what had caused their son's illness. He had ordered some blood tests, but it could take days to run them all, and Ryan needed to stay in the hospital until the results were in. Until then, there was really nothing Patty or David could do, and so Dr. Stevens suggested that they go ahead and actually nod off and try to get some rest. 3 days later, on July 12th, Dr. Stevens strode down the hospital hallway, followed closely by 2 men wearing black suits. The doctor was totally on edge. In his long career as a pediatrician, he'd seen a lot of shocking things, but nothing like this. Dr. Stevens eventually came to a stop outside of a room where he knew Patty and David were staying. Ryan was not in the room with them. This was a room just for the parents. Dr. Stevens turned around and told the 2 men in suits to please wait in the hall for a second so that he, the doctor, could go in first and speak to the couple. The 2 men in suits nodded and stayed put, and Dr. Stevens, he took a deep breath, turned around, and then knocked on the door, but then before waiting for an answer, he just opened it up and went inside. Patty and David were sitting on the bed inside the room, looking tired but also hopeful. Dr. Stevens immediately told them that he had good news. Their baby, Ryan, was going to be okay. Dr. Stevens watched relief wash over both parents, and then Patty asked the doctor, when could they see their son? Dr. Stevens paused. He knew what he was about to say next was going to start a very difficult conversation. He explained that Ryan's diagnosis, while not fatal, was still very serious and deeply concerning. According to lab reports, Ryan had high levels of ethylene glycol in his system, and ethylene glycol was one of the main ingredients in antifreeze. It was extremely toxic if consumed, and there was no way a baby of Ryan's age could ingest antifreeze on his own. He couldn't even crawl yet. Dr. Stevens paused to gauge Patty and David's reaction, looking for any signs of guilt or panic, but their faces were blank with confusion. So Dr. Stevens continued, being very careful to keep his tone detached as he made his meaning crystal clear. There is only one way Ryan could have antifreeze in his system, and that would be if someone deliberately fed it to him. In short, he was telling the parents that their child had been intentionally poisoned, and Patty and David were the main suspects. Dr. Stevens watched the parents closely as they finally registered what he was saying. Their eyes went wide and their mouths fell open. He half expected them to begin protesting, but they actually just didn't say anything at all. They just stood there, stunned. Then Dr. Stevens walked over to the door and rested his hand on the doorknob, and then he told the parents that, given the circumstances, he had contacted both the Missouri Division of Family Services and the police. Then Dr. Stevens opened the door to reveal the 2 men in suits. They were detectives with the St. Louis Police Department, and they were here to interview Patty and David. The little room fell silent as Dr. Stevens watched Patty and David stand up and follow the 2 detectives down the hallway towards 2 rooms where each parent would be interviewed separately. 9 days later, Patty stood at her son's bedside in the Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital. Ryan smiled up at her with no breathing tubes in the way. He cooed and grabbed at the air. Patty wanted to reach down and pick him up, but she was too anxious. 2 nurses stood in the corner of the room like guards, watching her every move. When the detectives had interviewed her the previous week, they'd asked her a lot of invasive questions about her marriage and her baby. They kept repeating that either she or her husband must have poisoned Ryan. The whole thing just felt like some sick joke. Patty insisted she was innocent. She had no idea how her son ended up with antifreeze in his system, but she knew she and David were not to blame. The police did eventually let them go, and they'd spent every night at the hospital since then, but still, every time Patty left her room, she could feel the staff looking at her with intense suspicion. Patty turned and made eye contact with one of the nurses standing in the corner of the room. Patty asked if she could hold her baby. The nurse hesitated and then said, "Yes, you can." Patty reached down, but before she could pick Ryan up, Dr. Stevens came into the room. Patty instinctively pulled her arms back. She'd felt like she'd been caught doing something wrong, even though all she really wanted to do was just hold her baby. Dr. Stevens came over to Ryan's bedside and took a look at him. Patty knew her son had been improving, but she was still kind of surprised when Dr. Stevens said Ryan was healthy enough to leave the hospital. Patty broke into a huge smile at this news. She'd been so confused and anxious, but now her son was healthy again. The police hadn't arrested her and her husband. It sounded like everything was going to be okay. But then she saw the doctor's expression shift. He explained that Ryan was being released from the hospital, but he was not going home with Patty and David. The police investigation was still ongoing, and until they knew more, Dr. Stevens had to release Ryan into the custody of the state. Ryan was going to be placed in foster care. Patty was stunned and heartsick. She'd assumed once Ryan got better, they'd be able to move on. But now she realized this problem was going to be much bigger and go on much longer than she'd anticipated. But more than anything else, she was just worried about some stranger taking her baby home. She had no way of knowing if the foster family would actually take good care of him. Patty wanted to scream, but looking at Dr. Stevens' face, she knew it wouldn't make any difference. So she turned away from the doctor and sat down next to Ryan's hospital bed, saying she wouldn't leave his side until she absolutely had to. 6 weeks later, Patty, David, and David's parents arrived at a state-sponsored childcare facility in St. Louis for a visit with baby Ryan. Ever since they'd left the hospital, Patty and her husband had been attending these meetings every Thursday. Patty was excited to see her son, but she was frustrated that the police investigation still was not over. As long as the police were still looking into Ryan's case, she couldn't bring him home. And so the only time she got with her son were these 1-hour-long meetings just once per week. Ryan's foster parents would drop him off at the childcare facility and then pick him up as soon as Patty and David left. To Patty, the whole situation felt ludicrous and backwards, but at the same time, she would much rather spend just an hour with her son each week than no time at all. Patty, David, and David's parents entered the building, and right away, a social worker met them at the door, and she was holding Ryan. Patty's heart leapt when she saw her son. He looked healthy and he smiled as soon as he saw her. Patty reached out and took him from the social worker's arms and carried him down the hallway into a small playroom. The social worker followed the family inside to supervise their visit. For the next hour, Patty, David, and David's parents showered baby Ryan with attention. For Patty, it was bittersweet. They should have been doing these things at their home, not in some facility. When the hour was almost up, David's parents got up to leave. David offered to walk them to their car, and the social worker went along too. They all left the room, and Patty was suddenly alone with her son for the first time in 6 weeks. Suddenly, Ryan began crying. Patty knew he must be hungry, and his foster parents had left a bag for him, so she checked inside of it and found a bottle of formula. She took it out, cradled Ryan in her arms, and began feeding it to him. Patty gazed down at her son, who looked totally content drinking out of his bottle. She held on to hope that she would have him back home soon, and this entire situation would just be over. 3 days after the visit, Patty and David were sitting on their porch looking out across the lake when a police cruiser pulled up in front of their house. 2 officers stepped out, walked up, and announced that they had a warrant. They were there to search their home. Patty could see that her husband was about to protest, but she nudged him, basically saying, "Be quiet, let this happen." At this point, she didn't care what the police did. And the sooner they finished their investigation, the sooner they would realize the parents had done nothing and Ryan could come home. And so while the detectives searched their house, Patty and David just sat together on the porch, not really saying anything. There wasn't anything to say. They both just wanted this to be over. After about an hour, Patty heard the officer's footsteps coming towards the front door. She turned to look at them and saw that they were carrying a large paper bag with the word evidence printed on the front. Before Patty could even say anything, they told her she was under arrest. She stared at them, frozen in shock. Beside her, David stood up out of his chair. He told the officers they can't be serious. But the detectives assured him they were. They said there were a lot of things that Patty and David didn't know. That very morning, Ryan's foster parents had had to take him to the Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital. Once again, he was suffering from symptoms of antifreeze poisoning. When police spoke to his foster parents, they learned that Patty had been left alone with him during their last visit, and she had fed him a bottle of formula. Forensic analysts tested the bottle, and found traces of antifreeze inside. Plus, the detectives had just discovered an open gallon-sized jug of antifreeze in Patty and David's basement. Patty was floored. She couldn't even process what they'd said about Ryan's bottle and the antifreeze in their basement. She was just too focused on the fact that her baby was sick again and back at the hospital. The police pulled Patty out of her seat and put handcuffs on her wrists. She heard them say she was being charged with assault with a deadly weapon. As they led her towards the police car, she craned her neck backwards and called out to her husband. She begged him to drive up to the hospital. One of them had to be with their son. Four days after his wife was arrested, David shifted in his chair in the waiting room of the Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital. For the past 4 days, he'd been living in his own private hell. He couldn't sleep, he barely ate. He could only think about two things: his wife being locked up in a jail cell, and his son sick in the hospital. And in fact, Ryan's condition was much worse this time than it was the last time. This time, he was not getting better, and in fact, the doctors had placed him on life support. A few minutes later, Dr. Stevens walked into the room. The doctor's face, which was usually professional and emotionless, was now drawn. David asked what was going on, and Dr. Stevens couldn't help himself, and he just let out this long sigh. Then the doctor explained that despite everything the hospital had tried, his baby Ryan was not getting better. The poison had damaged his organs beyond repair, and there was no chance he would recover. Dr. Stevens told David that if he was religious, that he should think about contacting a minister to baptize his baby Ryan before it was too late. The little boy was very likely not going to make it. These words hit David like a punch. The grief was so immediately overwhelming that he could physically feel it in his chest. But the worst part was, he still didn't understand how this was even happening. David could barely speak, but he managed to whisper out that his wife really needed to be here. Then David just ran to the waiting room payphone, and after calling the jail where Patty was being held, and then also the local courthouse, David ended up talking to the judge in charge of Patty's case. And David begged the judge to please release his wife so she could at least come to the hospital and be with her child during his final moments. David assumed the judge would have at least some sympathy for their situation, so he was surprised when, without the slightest hesitation, the judge said no. He called Patty a baby killer and refused to let her anywhere near her son. At this point, David's grief turned into rage. He slammed the phone down and crumpled into his chair. In the span of only 2 months, his perfect life had fallen apart. But despite what the police and the judge said, he knew Patty was innocent. She adored their son. There had to be a better explanation for what was going on. David took a deep, shuddering breath and then turned to see Dr. Stevens standing there. In a soft voice, the doctor said they needed David's permission to disconnect Ryan from his life support machine. David asked if there was absolutely anything else they could try. But Dr. Stevens just shook his head and said no. And so, with no other options, David did give his permission. That same afternoon, David went into Ryan's room in the intensive care unit, and he choked back tears as a minister baptized his son. And then at around 5 p.m. on September 7th, 1989, David held Ryan as the doctors turned off his life support. David would sit there cradling his baby until his baby slowly passed away. A few hours later, David had to make one of the most difficult phone calls of his entire life. He had to call Patty in jail to tell her that her son was dead. When Patty heard the news, it was like the whole world just faded away. All she could hear was David's voice, explaining how he'd tried to convince the judge to let her come to the hospital, but he'd refused. David swore he'd done everything he could. He was scraping up money from relatives to hire a good lawyer. He promised he would get her out of jail as soon as he could. And then, for at least a full minute, Patty and David just stayed on the phone saying nothing to each other. As the white cinder block walls of the jail's call center came back into focus, Patty saw the guard tap his wrist, letting her know her time was up. Patty told David she had to go, and then she hung up the phone and followed the guard out of the room, feeling totally numb. The next morning, Patty awoke to see a gruff-looking police deputy standing right outside the bars of her cell. He was there to give her even more bad news. Because her son had passed away, her charges were now being upgraded. In addition to assault with a deadly weapon, she was now being accused of first-degree murder. Patty grabbed a pillow and put it over her face. She felt like she'd been dragged into an alternate universe. She just couldn't understand how any of this could be real. The following month, in October, Patty sat on a plastic chair inside of the jail doctor's office. Across from her was a young physician who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world right now. And frankly, Patty felt the same way. She told the doctor she'd been feeling overwhelmed. Her hair was falling out, she was gaining weight, and she wasn't menstruating. At first, she just assumed that the stress of this horrible situation she was in was making her physically sick. But now, she was beginning to think it actually might be more than that. The doctor did not seem very sympathetic, but he did run a few tests, including collecting blood and urine samples. And while he waited for test results, she went back to her cell. A few hours later, the doctor came by to deliver the news. It turned out Patty was pregnant. 4 months later, in February of 1990, Patty gripped the sides of her hospital bed, her knuckles turning white from the pain of her latest contraction. When she'd gone into labor, she was transferred from the jail to a nearby emergency room. Patty was in a lot of pain from all the contractions, but mostly she was just feeling frustrated and angry because here she was, giving birth to her second child, and her husband was not even allowed to be there. And also, on top of that, she was grieving the loss of her first child. Patty could hear the labor and delivery nurse instructing her to push, and so Patty dug her fingers into the mattress and squeezed her eyes shut, and she felt like her body was going to rip open, and then suddenly she heard the sound of her baby crying. The nurse lifted up the newborn, and with a smile, she announced that it was a boy. Patty softened her grip on the bed. Still out of breath, she said that she and her husband had already decided on a name. David Jr., or DJ for short. Patty reached out for her child, and the nurse handed the baby over to her, and Patty held her newborn son tight against her chest. But her joy only lasted a few moments, because before long, the nurse gave Patty a very sympathetic expression, and then reached in and grabbed DJ, and then took DJ out of the room. Patty had known this was going to happen. She'd been told that, just like Ryan, DJ would be placed directly into state custody. Now she hadn't just lost one child, she'd lost two. Patty rolled over in her bed, sobbing. 2 weeks after giving birth to DJ, Patty sat in the jail's call center with a phone pressed against her ear. David had called to talk to her, and his voice was tight with concern. He said it was about DJ. Patty didn't think she could handle any more bad news, but she asked her husband, what was wrong, and he said DJ's foster parents had to take him to the St. Louis Children's Hospital that morning. Doctors said he was going to be okay, but he was extremely sick. At the thought of her youngest son being in the hospital, just like Ryan had been, Patty felt a knot rise in her throat. She asked David what kind of symptoms DJ had and if the doctors had diagnosed him with anything specific. And as David started listing off all of DJ's issues, Patty had an idea. She told her husband she had to go. She needed to call her lawyer before her phone time was up. David had managed to collect enough money from his family to hire an attorney for Patty. Since then, she and this lawyer had been preparing for her upcoming murder trial. And in her experience so far, the lawyer tended to be very busy and somewhat difficult to reach. Patty dialed her attorney's number. The phone rang so long she was worried he wouldn't answer, but finally he did pick up. But he sounded breathless and overwhelmed as usual. Patty knew this lawyer had a lot of cases to deal with, but for now, she really needed him to listen. Patty had a theory that she thought would prove her innocence, that she never gave Ryan antifreeze. The lawyer listened to this theory and then afterwards promised to do whatever he could. Patty thanked him and then hung up the phone. When she stood up, Patty actually felt pretty good. She was actually looking forward to her trial, which was scheduled for early 1991. It would be her chance to prove her innocence, bring DJ home, and put this horrible series of events in the past. About a year later, in early 1991, so January 31st, David sat in a quiet courtroom gallery, anxiously watching as 12 jurors re-entered the room. After 3 days of trial and 10 hours of deliberation, the jurors had finally reached a verdict on whether or not Patty was guilty of murdering her son Ryan. David tried to stay positive, but honestly, he did not feel very optimistic. The prosecution had been led by a tall, imposing man named George McElroy. He was the lead prosecutor in Jefferson County, Missouri, and he had presented an overwhelming amount of evidence against Patty. The prosecution's witnesses had testified that antifreeze had been found in Ryan's blood twice. The results were confirmed by 2 different laboratories using 2 different diagnostic methods. Plus, analysts had found traces of ethylene glycol in Ryan's bottle, and also an open container of antifreeze inside of David and Patty's house. All through the trial, David had anxiously waited for Patty's lawyer to present Patty's theory, the one she thought could prove her innocence. The lawyer had tried to make an argument for it, but he didn't call an expert witness to testify. So the judge wouldn't allow it into evidence, and the jury wasn't allowed to consider Patty's theory. David had been furious. It wasn't easy to pay for this lawyer, and now he felt like the lawyer had kind of failed and Patty's defense had been a total disaster. But there was nothing David could do now. The jurors sat down in the courtroom, and the jury foreman approached a microphone. David tapped his foot anxiously as he saw his wife at the front of the room, standing up, getting ready to hear what this foreperson had to say. Then David heard the foreman's voice through the courthouse speakers. But as the foreman read the verdict, it was like David's brain couldn't process what he was hearing. The jury had found Patty guilty of first-degree murder. After the verdict was read, David saw Patty collapse back into her chair. He couldn't see her face from his seat. All he saw were 2 policemen immediately handcuffing her and leading her out of the courtroom. David dropped his head into his hands, feeling a mixture of fury and despair. No matter what the prosecution had said, David did not have a shred of doubt about his wife's innocence. A week later, David was at home when he received a call from Patty's attorney. He was calling about Patty's sentence. She had just been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. David was crushed. He hung up the phone and started pacing back and forth across his living room, trying to think of some way he could fix this, but he just couldn't think of anything. 4 months after Patty's trial, in May of 1991, David sat in his living room alone. He looked out the window that faced their front yard, and he remembered that night, almost 2 years ago, when he and his wife were holding Ryan and watching the fireworks. Patty said she couldn't believe how much her life had changed since they had met, and David couldn't believe how much more it had changed since then. Their first child had died, their second child, DJ, was still living with a foster family, and just like when Ryan was in foster care, David was only allowed to visit DJ once a week for 1 hour. But David still hoped he could find a way to bring his family back together. David picked up the remote and turned on the TV and changed the channel to NBC. In just a few minutes, the program he was waiting for would come on. He had promised himself he would find a way to make things right again. Ever since Patty's verdict, he'd been working to get as much publicity as possible. He'd even convinced the producers of a hugely successful television show to cover Patty's story. And as the clock hit 8 p.m., the opening credits of Unsolved Mysteries, the TV show, began. David saw his wife's face on the television, followed by pictures of baby Ryan. The narrator began their story, and David leaned back in his chair. He'd done everything he could. Now he just had to hope for the best. At the same time this show was playing, across town, a geneticist and pediatrician named Dr. William Sly sat at home in his easy chair watching the same Unsolved Mysteries broadcast. As he saw pictures of baby Ryan and listened to interviews with Patty, the doctor found himself totally hooked into this story. He also thought he might be able to help David and Patty. Dr. Sly was the chairman of St. Louis University's Department of Biochemistry. When he heard Patty explain her theory of why she was innocent on this show, the same theory her lawyer did not present at her trial, Dr. Sly thought it made sense. And if Patty's theory really was true, then Patty really had been wrongly convicted. The next morning, when Dr. Sly arrived at work at his university laboratory, he pulled one of his colleagues aside, Dr. James Shoemaker, to tell him about Patty's theory. But when Dr. Shoemaker heard Patty's name, he stopped in his tracks. He said he'd heard about the case over a year ago, in April of 1990. He also thought Patty's theory sounded viable, so he'd reached out to one of the laboratories that tested Ryan's blood. He'd requested copies of all their lab reports, as well as any samples of Ryan's blood that they still had on hand. Back then, Dr. Shoemaker had done his own analysis, and his results didn't exactly match the ones that one of the laboratories that tested Ryan's blood had come up with. At the time, Dr. Shoemaker didn't know what to do with this information, but he still had all the paperwork in his office. Dr. Sly's heartbeat quickened. He told his colleague he needed to see those lab results right now. The two doctors raced down the hallway to Dr. Shoemaker's office. Dr. Sly anxiously looked on as his colleague rifled through a stack of papers on his desk. Dr. Shoemaker grabbed a few sheets and held them out. Dr. Sly picked up the documents and started scanning through them. And as he compared the original lab results with Dr. Shoemaker's analysis, Dr. Sly's jaw dropped. He asked Dr. Shoemaker for a piece of paper and a pen. He needed to write a letter to the county prosecutor. 4 months later, in September of 1991, County Prosecutor George McElroy stood in front of a huge crowd of reporters and a cameraman. He looked to his right and he saw Patty and David standing beside them. Both of them had totally stoic expressions on their faces. Prosecutor McElroy straightened his jacket nervously. This was the most important and most embarrassing press conference of his career. He leaned close to the microphone and announced that he'd done something unprecedented. He had asked the county circuit judge to dismiss the murder charges against Patty Stallings. He said after reading Dr. Sly's letter and consulting with another independent medical expert, he was finally convinced of Patty's theory. She'd been right all along. Baby Ryan didn't die from antifreeze poisoning. For over 2 years, Patty had been accused of poisoning her son, but she had never hurt him. Nobody had. In reality, Ryan had died from a rare genetic disorder called methylmalonic acidemia, or MMA for short, which caused his own body to produce a deadly chemical that was nearly identical to antifreeze. People with MMA can't fully digest food containing certain proteins and fats, many of which are in breast milk and baby formula. When these nutrients are not properly processed, they break down and turn into poison in the body. This causes vomiting, lethargy, trouble breathing, and organ damage. Patty had told her lawyer that she believed Ryan could have this disorder because his little brother DJ had it too. When DJ had fallen ill, his symptoms were the exact same as Ryan's, but instead of finding antifreeze in his blood, DJ's doctors had found a toxic substance called propionic acid. Propionic acid is often a telltale sign of MMA. It's also almost chemically identical to ethylene glycol, which is the poison found in antifreeze. The molecules are only different by a few carbon atoms, and so the two are easily mistaken for each other. When Dr. Sly saw Ryan's case on Unsolved Mysteries and then looked over the baby's lab results, this was the tiny discrepancy he found. The substance that analysts thought was ethylene glycol was actually propionic acid. Tragically, if Ryan had been treated at St. Louis Children's Hospital, where DJ had been correctly diagnosed and Patty was trying to take Ryan when he first got sick, all of this could have been avoided. Instead, the analysts at Cardinal Glennon and the other labs that tested Ryan's blood had unfortunately misidentified this naturally occurring substance as antifreeze, and their incorrect findings had been used to send Patty, an innocent woman, to prison for life. It is worth noting that the mix-up in going to the wrong hospital would not have necessarily saved Ryan because MMA has an extremely high mortality rate and long-term survival is not very likely. As prosecutor George McElroy stood before the crowd of reporters, he admitted he'd been wrong and then he personally apologized to Patty and David. He said even though their suffering could not be undone, he would make sure Patty was fully exonerated and she would get to bring her surviving son, DJ, back home. Patty and David filed lawsuits against the Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital, the diagnostic labs who'd misdiagnosed Ryan, and 3 different physicians. In 1993, they received an out-of-court settlement for an undisclosed amount. Their surviving son, DJ, battled the same genetic disorder that killed his brother, and unfortunately, it took his life too in 2013, when he was just 23 years old. From Ballin Studios and Wondery, this is Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballin. A quick note about our stories. We use aliases sometimes because we don't know the names of the real people in the story. And also, in most cases, we can't know exactly what was said, but everything is based on a lot of research. And a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Karis Allen Pash Cooper. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Ryan Potesta. Our coordinating producer is Taylor Sniffen, and our managing producer is Sophia Martins. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and researchers are Sarah Vitak and Tasia Palakonda. Fact-checking was done by Sheila Patterson. For Ballin Studios, our head of production is Zach Levitt. Script editing is by Scott Allen and Evan Allen. Our coordinating producer is Matub Zaire. Executive producers are myself, Mr. Ballin, and Nick Witters.